Senator Malcolm Roberts, thank you for coming on my show. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, Tom. And first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Senator in Federal Parliament, the National Parliament for Australia, and I represent the state of Queensland along with 11 other senators for our state. We have Queensland is the pointy bit in Australia. It's the second largest state. I think it's 2.5 times the size of Texas, the area of Texas. Population's about 5 million people, 4 million voters. We go from the tropics, well into the tropics, right down to temperate regions. And we have the amazing barrier reef on most of our eastern coastline. Most of our people live in, almost half our people live in the capital city and a coastal area just south of the capital city of Brisbane. We're the only state in Australia, this may surprise some people, we're the only state in Australia with more people outside the capital city than inside the capital city. So we're decentralized in many ways. Most of our people, though, live along the coast and in major metropolitan towns. And the major towns in Queensland, the second largest is about 200,000 people. The third largest is about 120,000 people. And then the others are around 80 to 100. So that'll give you some degree of understanding. The coastline is a very good climate, very productive, some decent soils. We don't have the soils that you have in America, generally speaking. When we go west of the coastline, we cross a small mountain range, which varies around 2,000 feet high to 5,000 feet high in the tropics. Then we go on a long westward sloping ground that goes towards central Australia into the heart of the country, which is below sea level. We have some very good agriculture there, but most of it is very cyclical weather. It can be very dry for prolonged periods and then floods for shorter periods. That gives, and where our main export is coal. We've got the best coking coal in the world for making steel. We're close to major markets for that. We've also got very high quality thermal coal for making electricity. Our other exports are food, beef in particular, sugarcane. We're large growers of sugarcane. Tourism's big industry, although the climate freaks, the climate alarmists are trying to destroy the Barrier Reef as a tourist destination by saying it's dying, when it's far from dying. It's got record coral cover. And also education. We supply a lot of education to people overseas who come here for our universities. We're a big mining area. Coal is our number one export. We export many other minerals as well, metals. There you go.
Could you tell me more about One Nation? What is One Nation? What is the goal? And how do they set themselves apart from other political organizations?
Well, I'll answer the last one first. We set ourselves apart from other organizations politically in this country by just telling the truth. We don't worry about what your reaction is. We just tell the truth. And we have a little slogan that says, we have the guts to tell you, to say what you're thinking. Because a lot of people tend to be timid in politics and about politics. They're afraid of being slammed for having certain views. So what we have is two, I would call them tired old parties, Tom. The Liberal Party, which is about 70 years of age, maybe 80 years old. It's becoming, they tout themselves as centre-right. And I don't like those terms because they mean different things to different people. But they've become basically left-wing because they followed the Labor Party, which is a socialist party. The Labor Party is no longer the party of the workers. It used to be the party of the workers. In fact, the Labor Party, I'm defining One Nation by giving you a little idea of the political landscape. So the Labor Party is Australia's oldest existing political party. It was formed before our country was formed. It was formed around 1893 after a massive strike in the country to protect workers' rights. It then started, the Labor movement then became political with the Labor Party, entered federal politics. It was while it was a socialist party, and I don't aspire to socialism at all, I think it's a way to kill a country. I do recognize the old Labor Party up until about the 40s as being genuine in their efforts. They really believed what they were doing, and they were sincere, they were patriotic, they looked after workers. The modern Labor Party is nothing like that. They've sold themselves out to globalists. They've sold out the workers. They want to shut coal mines. Their policies are destroying manufacturing. So they're the two major parties. We then have a national party, which is used to look after farmers and rural regions. It no longer does now. It's formed a coalition with the Liberals, and it's now just a voice in the wilderness. It doesn't really support anything other than Liberal policies. And then we have the Greens, which grew a lot in the last election in terms of representation. They've now got 2 senators from every state, so they've got 12 in a federal parliament, which makes them about 1/6 to 1/7 of the senators. They've got about 4 out of 151 representatives in the lower house. So they're a force. But they basically hide behind the pretense of supporting the environment, whereas what they're doing is they're introducing globalist policies from the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. So One Nation grew when Pauline Hanson, our party founder and the first representative in Parliament, she just said things as they were, and we got a massive following. I wasn't interested too much in politics back then. That was in 1996. She was a real threat to both the tired old parties, and so they did whatever they could to flatten her. They gave her very false terms. They called her a racist, homophobe, and all the rest of it, which was complete nonsense. She's got a wonderful reputation amongst the Aboriginals, the genuine Aboriginals in our country. She's very patriotic. They actually then trumped up charges and jailed her. She went to jail for 13 weeks before she was released on appeal. And so she came back into politics around 2015, and our party grew very quickly. And now we're a very strong party at the grassroots. We've only got 2 representatives in the federal parliament. We've just missed out on another 2 joining us. We've got representatives in the state of New South Wales, in the state of Queensland, and we almost got some representatives in the state of Western Australia. So that's where our party is. We stand for Australia, number one. Some people call Pauline Hanson the Trump of Australia. She's probably a bit more sophisticated than Donald Trump. We admire Donald Trump. We like what he's done, but we're very, very independent thinking.
Cool. And can you tell me some of the policies that you support? What are the goals of your party?
We've got the goal of our party is to bring back Australia. We don't make any apologies about that. We are tired of the Liberal Labor duopoly. They act as a uniparty, Tom. They're basically there's very little policy difference between the two. One used to be called right wing, which is a misnomer. The other one was called left wing. But the two have merged, trying to get the middle ground. And then they've both gone to what some people would call the left, following the Greens. Because what's happening is the United Nations is introducing policies and the World Economic Forum through the Greens, and then both the other parties adopt them. So we're coming in to bring a breath of fresh air into the Parliament and to bring back Australia rather than send it to the globalists. So we have 3 basic bedrock areas of policy. The first one is cost of living. The second one is security, if you like, security of living. And the third one is the future, infrastructure, setting up ourselves for the future. What we've been doing is we've been very strong opponents of the global COVID response, if you could call it that. It's really a mismanagement. It's been, I don't know what you think of it in America, but it's been very, very poorly managed. There's been a lot of deceit and control around it. It's introducing a lot of policies to control our people rather than protect health. It has been very detrimental to people's health, mental health, as well as physical health. So we have set ourselves apart from that, because what we want is proper healthcare, recognition of doctor-patient relationship, in bodily autonomy, individual rights to take or not take an injection. So that's the basic approach we're using. So I'm happy to go into some of the policies in each of the 3 bedrock areas if you want.
Sure. Talk about housing, because I've had a few other Australian politicians come on who've said that housing prices in Australia are quite overblown right now. And what are the reasons for that, and what would your solutions be?
Right. We have to understand the cause of the housing problem and the housing challenge, Tom. We believe that government is not there to make jobs. Government is not there to be an employer. Government is not there to provide for people. Government has 3 basic responsibilities, I believe. One is to protect life. That's the primary responsibility. The second responsibility is to protect property, to stop people stealing your property. And the third is to protect freedom. In the last 2.5 years of mismanagement and deceit around COVID, the government has killed people, stolen property, and destroyed freedom and individual human rights. So what we want to do is to protect those 3 things. So I said that because people these days around the West have had many years of prosperity, and they've got used to government supplying things. And that's the worst possible place to be, because the government then makes us dependent. And that's something that the UN is deliberately encouraging. Government is not there to make us dependent. Government is there to make us independent and ensure that we can thrive. So we don't believe the government should be in employment. The government shouldn't be stimulating jobs, directing with tax. What it should be doing is creating an environment where the individual employer and the individual worker can have a good relationship to be prosperous and productive. So with that in mind, what we see is the core problems that cause the housing problem are the ridiculous tax system in this country, where multinational companies, which account for 90% of our large companies in Australia, pay very little or no company tax. So they're freeloading off us, which raises taxes for the individual. The tax on housing, when you look at the basic structure of the taxation system and the housing industry, is around 50% of the price of a house is in tax. So that means the effective tax rate is 100%, which is bloody ridiculous. So that's the first thing, the tax system. The tax system also then, because we don't tax multinationals, foreign companies, which are 90% of our major companies in this country, hardly at all, the tax burden falls on individuals. So the tax rates are high, which makes it difficult to have an after-tax income and to pay off a house, the price of which is already inflated. We also have very high immigration for our population size. We're a population of about 25 million, almost 26 now. And we used to have, until COVID was introduced into this country 2.5 years ago, we used to bring in about 250,000 immigrants a year, which is 1% every year, and that was inflating the cost of housing, because it increased the demand for housing. It also put pressure on infrastructure, and it suppressed wages. So we've had very little wages growth, but we've now got massive inflation, not as high as the States or as high as Britain. So I'm trying to paint a picture of the economic scene and the social scene here. Australia has always been a land where people aspired to own their own land, their own patch of dirt with their own house on it, and be independent. We are generally suburban dwellers, but the United Nations and World Economic Forum are pushing increased city housing in what we call stack and pack in high-rise apartments. So what we need to do with housing is to get the government out. Oh, the other thing we need to say in housing is we have if you average it out over the country, we have one of the lowest population densities in the world. But when you look at the urbanization, we're one of the most urbanized countries in the world, behind only, I think, Hong Kong. Most of our people are in the southeast, and most of them, as I said, are in capital cities in this country. Every state, the capital city, has more people than the rest of the state. So that puts pressure on land prices. In addition to that, we have absurd environmental regulations that are putting pressure on the cost of developing land. I saw some figures about 5 years ago that showed that the price of building a house, the cost of building a house in Houston, Texas, was about the same as building a house in Brisbane. But the selling price of the house in Brisbane was way, way higher than in Houston, Texas, because of the absurd cost of our land itself. So we have some very stringent and overly stringent regulations on environment, which are just ridiculous, which are basically imposed by the UN. So we have high environmental costs. We have suppressed wages for a while in this country. We have increased the demand for housing. So what we want to do is we want to get back to basics, fix the tax system so that people have more money to spend. And also we want to limit immigration to net zero. In other words, if we have 70 to 100,000 people coming into the country in a year, if we have 70 to 100,000 people leaving Australia every year, then we want only 70 to 100,000 people coming in to replace them. No additional migration until we catch up with their infrastructure, which is lagging because governments don't have the foresight or the courage to build the infrastructure, and until their housing prices stabilize again. So we want to fix tax. We want to fix the environmental regulations. They're the things that we want to look. One Nation always goes to the root causes. We don't dance around and sugarcoat things. We just deal with the root causes.
Cool. And so you're saying that the tax rate on buying a new house is 50%. So you have to pay 50% higher than what the house would normally cost in taxes. And why is that? What was the policy that led to that? And why would taxing rich businesses offset that?
So when we buy a house, we don't pay another 50% tax. But what I'm saying is the price of a house is about 50% tax when you look at all the taxes that go into building that house. So the cost of a house is 50% tax, which makes the tax rate effectively 100%.
Could you explain that more? Like when you say the cost of building a house is 50% tax, what does that mean? Does that mean because the first thing that comes to mind is safety measures like gas lining and insulation, those kinds of things.
No, they're just part of construction. I'm talking about the taxes along the way, land taxes, stamp duty, the basic costs of building the house. So I'm not talking about things like putting in gas lines and putting in water, and that's just part of developing an acreage. But I'm talking about the actual costs of taxation along the way to building that house. So that bumps up the price a lot. The cost of a loaf of bread in this country has been calculated as 50% tax. So 50% tax means that you've got 100% effective tax rate. The cost of what are the other components? Yeah, the cost of fuel is about 70% tax. So that makes the effective tax rate about 230%. So what we're saying here is because governments have neglected or deliberately avoided levying tax on multinationals, deliberately avoided that, then the balance of taxation has fallen, the tax burden has fallen on the individuals and families and small businesses. For example, we are now the world's #1 exporters of energy. Our natural gas from the Northwest Shelf around the northwest of Western Australia, we're now the largest exporters of liquefied natural gas in the world. We're ahead of Qatar. So that might surprise some people because most people think the Arabs and the Middle East export more gas, but no, we do. The United States is a big exporter too, as I understand it. So we export that, but we get a fraction of what Qatar gets in revenue from selling its gas. We get bugger all for our natural gas. We get some royalties in some deals, but not a lot. We get very little tax. The gas that is imported from Australia into Japan, the Japanese levy around $3 billion a year on import duties for our gas. We get nothing. So what we're doing is giving our gas away in deals to major companies like Chevron, Shell, and other multinationals. And Chevron negotiated a deal with the so-called socialists, the Labour Party, that means they will never, ever pay any tax on gas that's exported from Australia anywhere in the world. We also have at the same time, Tom, one of the highest gas prices for domestic gas. The multinationals have said, they flipped the bird at us and just said, go to hell. They made an agreement with us that they would supply or keep in reserve 15% of the gas production for our domestic use. They've avoided that. And our governments have not fulfilled their responsibilities to the people to enforce that. So that's one of the reasons why the tax rates, the housing costs are so damn high.
And what is the inspiration? Why were these policies put into place that puts this overburden of cost of gas and things on the public? And why are there so many subsidies for international companies, international countries to do this? How did that come about?
That's a very good question, isn't it? It's a wonderful question. If we go back to 1953, there was a double taxation legislation introduced, Tom. Up until that time, a foreign company could make an application every year to the Treasury Department, which is part of the federal government, and get an exemption from paying income tax or company tax. And in 1953, the so-called private enterprise company party, the Liberal Party, decided to abolish the need to do that and just legislate so that foreign companies didn't have to pay much tax at all. So you'd have to go back and ask them, but we don't know why. We just know it's wrong. Deals would have been made for sure. We also see now that the foreign-owned multinationals basically control our business organizations, the Business Council of Australia, and what's the other? I've forgotten the major industry, Australian Chamber of Commerce. They tend to dominate, and they tend to pay their dues to run that entity, and that entity is a very big lobbyist for minimizing taxation. So the other thing, so the socialist government, as I said, they gave Chevron the deal and other multinationals a deal by invoking the petroleum rent resources tax, which is really a way of saying you don't need to pay tax ever again. So you'll have to ask them. But that was in the 1980s, mid 80s. So I mean, this is absurd. It's absolutely stupid. Norway has bankrolled its economy on the revenue it levies for the exports of its oil and gas. And it's got a huge fund that looks after its people's welfare. We've done the reverse. We've said, just take it, rape us, and just go. But, you know, if you look at energy prices, Tom, Australia has our coal reserves are much smaller than China or America or Russia. But per capita, we have the highest reserves in the world. But more significantly, our coal is very, very low in real pollutants like sulfur, nitrous oxides. Our coal is basically, with modern scrubbing technology, our power stations don't produce any pollutants at all. So just carbon dioxide and water vapor. And carbon dioxide and water vapor are essential to all life on this planet, and not a pollutant at all. So what we've seen in this country is the cost of our electricity used to be one of the cheapest in the world. The price of our electricity used to be one of the cheapest in the world. It was generated by coal in the Hunter Valley of Australia, and also in Queensland, and also by brown coal in Victoria. And that's what drove our economy. We had the cheapest electricity in the world. We have now got, despite having very close and high quality coal and close to major metropolitan areas and close to the power station, so very little transport costs, we have now got amongst the highest prices of electricity. The prices of electricity in this country have increased by about 3 times in the last couple of decades, all artificially due to UN regulations, UN restrictions to do with climate change, which is a complete scam. And our party calls it out. We know that the Liberal Party has many skeptics within its ranks. We know that the Labor Party has quite a few skeptics within its ranks in federal parliament. But they both believe this bullshit from the United Nations that we need to cut our use of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. What that's done is it's given subsidies to international companies, mainly international companies, foreign owned, and particularly Chinese, and it's given subsidies to billionaires in this country who are installing wind and solar installations, and that is being artificially favored by the energy regulators, and that's destroying the efficiency of coal-fired power stations. Coal-fired power stations produce electricity at about half to 1/3 the cost of solar and wind unsubsidized. But now it's driving, because of the subsidies for the unreliable solar and wind, which are also unstable and intermittent, and adding more cost to instability and managing the instability of our electricity grids, we're now destroying the coal sector and raising our prices. So these days, that's highly significant, because about 50 years ago, 60 years ago, Australia was almost self-sufficient in everything. Anything that we needed, we could make here. And now we import almost everything. And our manufacturing sector has been gutted, because the number one cost of manufacturing used to be labor. That's no longer the case with automation. The number one cost of manufacturing today is electricity everywhere around the world. The cost of labor is not the highest component, electricity is. So when we artificially inflate our electricity prices by about 3 times what they should be, we're destroying manufacturing. We're also destroying the cost of raising the cost of pumping water for our farmers, which hurts our agricultural. So we're actually on a road to suicide economically by our own party, by our own policies within our two main parties, which act as a duopoly. The differences in policies between Liberal and Labor are nothing. There's no substantial difference in their major policies.
So a few things there. One is climate change. Like, I'm a big supporter of the science behind climate change. So why do you think that that's a hoax, or do you specifically think that just the UN policies are a hoax? What is it that you disagree with in the topic about climate change in general?
So if you're a supporter of the science behind climate change, you won't mind me asking you to give me the evidence that the empirical scientific evidence that proves that carbon dioxide from human activity affects climate and needs to be cut. I've been pushing that question for, and I invite you to send it to me. And what I've done is I've held all the parties in this country accountable. I've held academics, I've held universities accountable. I've held NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies accountable. I've held bureaucrats accountable, journalists accountable, politicians accountable. No one has ever provided the basis for any policy to cut carbon dioxide from human activity. So we need to understand the core claim. The core claim is that by burning hydrocarbon fuels, sometimes wrongly termed fossil fuels, but by burning hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, we create carbon dioxide, which is raising the temperature of our planet. Let's have a look at that basic premise, and then have a look at what's needed to prove that premise and why it's so easy to disprove and has been disproven. Hydrocarbon fuels contain basically hydrogen atoms and carbon atoms. When they're burnt in the atmosphere in oxygen, they form H2O, which is water vapor, and CO2. If it's burnt efficiently. If it's not burnt efficiently, it also forms carbon monoxide, as in a car exhaust has some carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a toxin, extremely dangerous, but it's very little in output. And most power stations, etc., get rid of it, and also they scrub it out, or they burn it more efficiently, so that we actually end up with water vapor, H2O, and carbon dioxide, CO2. So what happens with carbon dioxide is that carbon dioxide is a natural trace gas in our atmosphere. It's about 0.04%, Tom. That's why it's scientifically called a trace gas. It's categorized scientifically as a trace gas because there's bugger all of it. Now, what the UN is saying is that carbon dioxide from human activity is affecting our climate seriously and causing warming, unusual warming. It's also said to be causing unprecedented storms, floods, droughts. Anything that happens is blamed on that, and it's complete bullshit. What happens?
Oh, go ahead. Well, yeah, so I was going to, you asked for the evidence. I'm pretty familiar with the evidence because we can measure certain kinds of CO2 levels in the atmosphere by looking at ice core data and ocean level data. And we can compare how CO2 affects things in a chamber. So for example, we can have like a fishbowl, put CO2 into it, even a moderate amount, and point a sun at it, and we can measure that the heat of that container will be significantly higher than one with even a slightly less percentage of CO2, because CO2 is like a mirror. If you put a bunch of mirrors that reflect the sunlight back into the case, it will raise the temperature of the case. And so any moderate amount of CO2 will increase the temperature of whatever medium you're using, which is why we see a temperature increase in the global temperature due to increases in CO2. So even though it's not we're not like adding 50% of the atmosphere is CO2, a small increase will cause a temperature change, and the temperature change can cause climate effects, weather differences, different kinds of tornadoes, hurricanes, increases the magnitude of those things, and the different effects we see in California with the droughts. So, why
So
does that not make sense?
what doesn't make sense about what you just said?
Mhm.
Every single point you just raised does not make sense, and I'll explain why. I certainly agree that long wave radiation is absorbed by carbon dioxide. The sun's rays or the energy from the sun comes through the atmosphere and has basically no warming effect on the atmosphere itself. The sun's rays and sun's energy hit Earth's surface, either the oceans, which is 71% of the Earth's surface, or the land mass, and that absorbs that energy. It raises the temperature of the land. It raises the temperature of the surface levels of the oceans. What then happens is that some of that radiation is re-emitted as long wave radiation. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the water vapor in the atmosphere, much more significant. There is 25 times more water vapor on average than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is around about 0.04%. The water vapor is an average of around 1%, so about 25 times more. Not only is water vapor much more common in the atmosphere, much more prevalent in the atmosphere, water vapor absorbs more long wave radiation, the stuff you were talking about. Now, water vapor has a net cooling effect on the atmosphere. It's a temperature modulator. It has a net cooling effect. What the United Nations is saying is that as you increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we're talking about trivial amounts, then the impact is not much, but it supposedly increases the warming effect of water vapor. Now, when you have the United Nations models, they have never provided any specific quantified effect of human carbon dioxide on weather or climate, ever, never. NASA's got it into space studies, has not done so. Our scientific agency, the CSIRO, has not done so. No entity anywhere in the world has. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But what happens is you've got the atmosphere touching the land surface. When the land surface touches the atmosphere, heat is transferred by conduction. That's really important. Heat is transferred by conduction. When the atmosphere warms, it rises, and it rises through convection. That's the second way of transferring heat. So we've got conduction and convection. And we've also got some radiation. Now, the radiation component is very small. But if the radiation component, I shouldn't say if, the radiation component does raise the temperature of carbon dioxide and hydrogen. But we're not talking about a sealed glass fishbowl. We're not talking about a laboratory instrument. We're talking about an open atmosphere where the forces of conduction, convection, and latent heat transfer overwhelm. And that, if carbon dioxide, any gas in the free atmosphere, in an open dynamic atmosphere that's warmed, naturally rises and moves away from the Earth's surface. It takes heat away from the Earth's surface. So that is well known. And the eminent scientists around the world disagree on the effect of carbon dioxide warming, being impacted by radiation. Some say it has a slight warming effect up to about 20 parts per million, which is what, 0.002%. As you increase the carbon dioxide, and this has been simulated in a ModTrans simulator in the United States, as you increase the level of carbon dioxide, it has a neutral effect. And when you go to excessive carbon dioxide, it can have a cooling effect. So that's what I'm saying there is disputed. Now, it's not disputed that carbon dioxide in a sealed bowl will be warmed, but carbon dioxide very quickly re-emits that radiation, and it stimulates the removal of energy from the atmosphere. But regardless of where we sit with that, let's have a look at the data itself, because we then have to have a look at the temperature data. You said that the temperature of the Earth is warming. The most accurate measurement of temperature on the Earth atmosphere is NASA's satellites, which have been, they send signals back to Earth, and they're the best form of measuring the temperature around the whole globe. And they give a good average for any time of night or day. The University of Alabama at Huntsville, with Roy Spencer and John Christie, Professor John Christie, who used to contribute to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a lead author, until he realized it was a crock and it was dishonest on the science. He resigned from the IPCC. Christie and Spencer take that NASA's satellite temperature data, and they produce a global record. And that global record shows that the temperature since 1995, Tom, has been basically flat. And it's naturally varying. So I'm not saying it's flat every year, the same every year. I'm saying it varies from year to year, but there's been no overall long-term trend in warming, none at all. If you remove the El Nino and La Nina cyclical components, there is definitely no warming trend at all. Temperatures are flat since 1995. Now, since 1995, China and India and Brazil have increased their output of carbon dioxide. So, yet the temperatures are flat. Now, so the next thing is to look at the component of human carbon dioxide and its impact on the atmospheric carbon dioxide. We've had two amazing global experiments in the last 14 years. You may remember the global financial crisis in 2008. In 2009, we had a massive recession in most countries around the world. Australia was spared that recession because we were still pumping out a lot of mineral exports and energy exports to China and other developing countries. So we didn't have that recession, but everywhere else around the world basically had a severe recession in 2009. When we have a recession, human industrial activity decreases. So we had a decrease in hydrocarbon use. That meant a decrease in human carbon dioxide production. And yet the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere kept increasing. So they're claiming what we need to do, the politicians are claiming we need to cut our output of carbon dioxide from human activity, and that will stop the increase in the atmosphere. Well, it's turned out to be complete bullshit, because we savagely cut our carbon dioxide production, and yet the level in the atmosphere continued increasing. In 2020, we had the recession due to COVID restrictions, not due to COVID, but due to government restrictions. Again, a massive decrease in the use of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Massive decrease in human production of carbon dioxide. And yet the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere continued increasing. And so what we've seen is that it doesn't matter if we do what the United Nations and their politicians are telling us and savagely cut our carbon dioxide output, it doesn't affect the level in the atmosphere. And the reason is very, very simple. There is a certain very low percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And people are saying, when you look at the global atmosphere, that's massive quantity, even though it's only 0.04%. The amount of carbon dioxide in dissolved form in the world's oceans is 50 to 70 times that in the entire atmosphere. Slight changes in solar activity lead to slight changes in ocean temperature over many, many centuries. And when that happens, the solubility of carbon dioxide in water, the oceans, which are up to 11 kilometers deep and cover 71% of the Earth's surface, it's a massive water body that absorbs or removes carbon dioxide, because the solubility of carbon dioxide in the oceans increases or decreases with temperature changes. So what you'll see is that on a seasonal basis, the carbon dioxide increases, decreases, because the majority of the oceans are in the southern hemisphere. So in our southern hemisphere summer, it warms the surface of the ocean. It releases a massive amount of carbon dioxide, and the level of carbon dioxide increases. In our winter, it absorbs. And the overall trend is up, but that reflects what happened centuries ago, and we know that for a fact. The other thing is that there's never been any evidence that shows that temperature drives carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There is evidence comprehensively, not only with what I've just said, but also in the fact of Henry's law, which is a fundamental law of chemistry, which shows that carbon dioxide changes follow changes of temperature. So temperature changes lead to changes in carbon dioxide. And what you'll see is that in the past, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have been far, far higher, up to 130 times higher than now. The levels of carbon dioxide when the dinosaurs were around about 5 times what they are now, and life flourished. Life flourished. We've had ice ages where carbon dioxide has been far higher. We've had warmer periods where carbon dioxide has been far lower. So what I'm saying is that carbon dioxide and temperature are independent. Carbon dioxide and human carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and human carbon dioxide are independent because the oceans control the carbon dioxide. But regardless, your states, about 35 of your 50 states, the highest temperature records were set in the 1930s and 40s, not recently. In Australia, the record temperature for any location in Australia was set in 1889, 1893. The heat waves were longer, more severe, more frequent in Australia in the 1880s and 1890s. The temperature was warmer in the 1880s and 1890s than today. We have had no warming for the last, 27 years. So basically bullshit, Tom.
Well, I'm quite familiar with that statistic, actually. And as far as I know, where is the window? Like this is the graph that I see. Oops, didn't mean to close that. There we go. This is the graph that I see. So if we look at the past like 5 years, there's clearly like a trend where it's balancing out there at the end, but the trend is clearly up. So if we just take the past 5 years, it still seems like it's going up. Like if I'm a YouTuber,
have a look at the bottom of your graph there. Sorry, go below the graph to the text. Data courtesy of National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Climatic Data Center. That is the data from ground-based temperature measurements. The ground-based temperature measurements have never, ever been audited until an Australian audited them. He recently, about 2 to 3 years ago, he audited them, did it comprehensively, one of our climate scientists. He got his PhD in climate science, a very intelligent man. He went through the United Nations temperature data and found it was very highly corrupted. The NOAA's, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's data has never been audited and is highly corrupted. It's been influenced. They say that there are 4 data sets around the world that are independent, and that is bullshit too, because I've proven, and Gavin Schmidt has acknowledged that they're not independent. They're all based on one temperature data set. The temperatures back when they first started measuring them around about the 1850s, they relied on one temperature source in the whole of the southern hemisphere. The temperature rises that you see in the 1980s to around 1995, they were inflated by a number of things. First of all, there was a natural trend from 1980 to 1976, actually, to 1995. You can see that. But they were inflated by the urban heat island effect, by tampering, deliberate tampering and inflation of data of warm temperatures by NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. You'll notice on your curve that from 1940, there was a decrease until 1976. 1976, there was a slight jump, which was entirely natural. Now, what we'll see is during the decrease from the 1940s down to 1976, we had the longest temperature trend in the last 120 years. And that was a cooling trend at a time when the Earth, when humans were going through a massive industrialization in the Second World War and the post-war economic boom. Then we've had a warming trend, which has been inflated. Then if you have a look from 1995 onwards, it's been flat. And you'll see that there's a spike in around 1998, I'm sorry. That was known to be a severe El Nino effect. That's that spike you see before it starts going flat. And then in 2016, there was another spike. And so what you'll see is entirely natural reactions there. We know that the longest temperature record in the world is the Central England temperature record, which is about 300 years long in duration. It shows nothing other than cyclical warming, cooling, warming, cooling. And also I challenged that graph there because in the 1880s and 1890s in Australia, the temperatures were far warmer, significantly warmer than today. So what I'm saying is that NOAA's temperature data is a highly corrupted ground-based temperature data, which does not measure realistically and accurately the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. And that's significant because the United Nations ignores the NASA's satellite data, which is known to be accurate and which has been confirmed by ground-based measurements and weather balloon radiosonde measurements. And instead, it uses a highly corrupted ground-based measurement, which is illustrated by NOAA.
Well, I think this agrees with the satellite data, like the past 1995 data. That it all agrees with the satellite data.
Only from 1979 onwards, when the satellite data only started in 79. But
Right.
we know that the temperature record in the past has been highly corrupted, and NOAA's data, NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies data, what's the other one? The Hadcrat. They're highly corrupted. As I said a little while ago, Dr. John McLean did the only audit of the United Nations and temperature data, the global the GHCN, what's that? The Global Climate Networks data, which the UN based on, found it to be highly corrupted. It's never been audited before. NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies has been shown publicly to be corrupting the data and artificially increasing the warming. We know that our Bureau of Meteorology in Australia has consciously and deliberately created warming where there's been no warming. And they use a term called homogenization of the data. It's a complete fiddle, and it doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. So the ground-based temperature data is corrupted.
Well, the GISS, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, that's the satellite data, right?
No, it uses ground-based temperature data. The Goddard Institute of Space Studies uses ground-based, and that's what I'm saying. The most accurate measurement, and NASA's own satellites and NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies won't use their own satellites. They use instead the corrupted ground-based data, definitely.
Well, they use both because the satellite data agrees with this and all of the other, because there's like a dozen different ways of measuring temperature, and they all tend to agree in the same thing. It's strange that all of the different studies all have the same data, but they're all corrupted. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
No.
Like how did they corrupt it? Because they come from different sources. If they happen to agree since 1979 with the satellite data, why don't you trust that they agree prior to 1979? Because they're using the scientific data, right?
No, that's the point. The temperature records in the past have been very, very poor. And not only that, the temperature records in the past have been artificially inflated by people like NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. I've challenged Gavin Schmidt on that. I can show you the correspondence. He corresponded with me until he admitted that the four global temperature, until he admitted that the temperature data sets that are used around the world are actually coming from one temperature data set. He denied responsibility for the temperature data set that NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies had. And so when I pointed that out, end of all correspondence with him. He couldn't come back at me anymore after that. So what you'll find is that the temperature data on the NOAA's record, on the GISS's data, is being falsified. The temperature record on the GHCN network has been falsified. The Hadcrat has been falsified. We know that.
Well, so I actually know a few people who work with there, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't been falsified, because if they had, they'd have to retract it from the double-blind peer review of different studies that they've been published. But I mean, if you could show that, that would be great. That would be definitely progress. But I'd have to leave that up to the experts.
Well, what we have to do is interrogate their data. There's nowhere, anywhere in the world, Tom, there is nowhere, anywhere in the world where they have quantified the specific effect of carbon dioxide from human activity on any climate record. Now, I'm the only person in the world. I'm not saying this as a matter of bragging or anything like that. I'm saying it because it's a startling fact that I'm the only politician anywhere in the world to have cross-examined for a prolonged period their government's national science agency. In our case, it's the Commonwealth Scientific and Industry Research Organization, CSIRO. CSIRO is a major contributor to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's climate body. CSIRO, I asked them for the first time when I've held them accountable, and we met with them, including their chief executive at the time, Dr. Larry Marshall, with their climate science team. They tried to dodge me, and then we eventually got the help of the science minister at the time to get a meeting with the CSIRO. And we said to the CSIRO, remember, they're major contributors to the United Nations. We said to them, provide us with the empirical scientific evidence that shows that carbon dioxide from human activity is a danger and needs to be cut. They presented us with data, and we didn't say what they could present. We said, up to you, whatever you wanted to present. In their presentation, Tom, they presented one paper on temperature, and that was Marcotte 2013. They presented one paper on carbon dioxide and the claimed effect. That was Harry's 2001. So after over 40 years of research, they had one paper on temperature and one paper on carbon dioxide. Marcotte et al. 2013, within 2 weeks of its release in 2013, was completely discredited by Canadian statistician Steve McIntyre. The lead author of that study, Marcotte himself, came out and said that you could not rely upon the sole temperature that was the temperature stack for the 20th century. He said that. He admitted it. He admitted McIntyre was correct. Yet the CSIRO relied upon his paper. When we pointed that out, they stopped relying on his paper and withdrew that. They stopped talking about it. So then they gave us a second paper on temperature. Oh, and by the way, in that first meeting with the CSIRO, after we were cross-examining them, they admitted that carbon dioxide from human activity, they have never said is a danger. Never. So we said, who has said that? Because the politicians are telling us that you've said it. And the CSIRO said, you better go and ask the politicians. The CSIRO admitted that they have never advised anyone that carbon dioxide from human activity is a danger to the planet. The next presentation, when they came back with Le Cavalier, instead of Marcotte et al., Le Cavalier 2017, again, we could not get, in this case, the temperature records from the authors. So once an author refuses to give you his data, it's immediately disqualified as scientific. But nonetheless, we tore it apart. And there's significant shortcomings in that paper which discredited the CSIRO. They accepted our criticism too of Harry's paper in the first on carbon dioxide in the first presentation. They replaced that with a paper by Feldman et al. 2015. And we discredited that. Then they came back with papers from 5 different entities, and they could not specify whether there was any proof to back up what they're saying. But when we tore those papers apart, they contradicted Marcotte, Feldman, Harry's, and Le Cavalier in places. They were contradicting even amongst themselves, even the 5 references they gave us later. But this might startle you. In the second presentation, each of the presentations was 2.5 hours long by the CSIRO and our cross-examination. Then the second presentation, the CSIRO, after our cross-examination, admitted, just across a narrow table, that today's temperatures are not unprecedented. Not unprecedented. And we said to them, well, hang on a minute. This climate change rubbish started with claims of unprecedented global warming. Now you're telling us it's not real. And then they said, but the temperature rate of increase in temperature is unprecedented. And we said, well, that's bullshit. Because if you look at the temperature record yourself and your own graph up there, it shows that the rate of temperature rise since 1995 has been flat. And yet we've had massive increases in carbon dioxide from human activity, thanks to China's industrialization, India's industrialization, ongoing high output from Brazil, America, and Europe. Yet the temperature has been flat. There's been no rate of temperature rise in the last 27 years. This doesn't stack up. All it needs is a bit of thinking and going into the data as we've done. So we've now got the CSIRO. I haven't got my data with me from the CSIRO, but we've shown that the CSIRO, ultimately, when they came to explaining causality, they couldn't do it, and they relied on models which have been proven wrong, completely wrong. But here's the fundamental point, Tom. For anyone to ascribe a policy about cutting carbon dioxide, you need to first of all say the effect using empirical data within a logical scientific framework that proves cause and effect. That's what science is. It's hard data, hard observations within a logical framework proving cause and effect that says carbon dioxide from human activity has this effect. Then the next thing you have to do is you have to quantify the specific effect of carbon dioxide from human activity on any temperature on any climate factor, whether it's temperature, ocean salinity, ocean alkalinity, snowfall, rainfall, droughts, storms, activity. No one has ever done that. Until you can do that, you cannot do the cost analysis, the cost benefit analysis of any alternative policies. And what you'll find is there's never been any cost benefit analysis done of the specific effect of carbon dioxide on any climate factor. So we asked the CSIRO in our second meeting. We said, you failed the first to show that it's dangerous. You admitted it wasn't. So we want to know the effect of human carbon dioxide on any climate factor in the last 10,000 years. And they came back and they could not show us any factor that's been affected by carbon dioxide from human activity in the last 10,000 years. Then we made it easy for them. After their third presentation, we said to them in Senate estimates hearings, we want to know the statistically significant change in any climate factor in the last 10,000 years. They could not identify one single climate factor that has experienced a change. What you'll see is there's been no trend in temperatures, no change in temperatures. What you'll see is significant cyclical variation in weather, whether it be rainfall, floods, droughts, storms, ocean temperatures, ocean salinity, ocean alkalinity. There has been no trend anywhere. There's been no change. You have to have a change there's been no change. And so what we can see is that they take short periods of time and say it's warming. Well, then they don't hang on and say, now, as you can see on your own graph, we've had 20 years of flat temperatures. I mean, your own graph says it.
Well, the part of the graph that you're talking about, the 1995 forward, does show warming. It's not at the same rate, but it's still warming. And
basically flat, Tom.
Not really. Like if I was on my...
Put it back up.
Okay. History. History. Recently closed. But the graph showed that trend was images. Let's see if I find the images. Oof, I don't know if I find the exact same one because I closed it. But I probably just you rewind the video and we can look at the graph that way. But
yeah, well, the thing is, it's not just a matter of temperature alone. What you've got to prove is the specific quantified effect of carbon dioxide from human activity on any temperature factor, on any climate factor. No one has ever done that. That's the end of that story, full stop. No one has ever done it. The other thing we need to do...
Well, just to clarify, so I wanted to mention that data that the satellites agree with, all of the other metrics, so I think there's 10 different ways they measure temperature, ocean temperature, air temperature, surface level temperature, all kinds of things. And they all agree with this data. But you're saying
no, they don't. The long-range temperature for the oceans is cooling. Over the last 9,000 years, the oceans are cooling.
I don't see that because I just saw a graph on that yesterday that said that it's increasing. That says that it's not cooling. I don't know why you think it's cooling, but as far as I know, every single data point in every scientific thing agrees with this, which is why every single scientist pretty much agrees with this.
No, that's not true either.
Well, I'm happy to take a bet on that one because I'm very familiar with several scientists who work in this field, and there is pretty much universal agreement of all the scientists on all of this data.
No, that's a false statement, Tom. You're wrong because Cook, who's a notorious misrepresentative of climate in Australia, I think he now works in Canada or America. He was part of the University of Queensland. He came up as the lead author of a paper that said 97% of scientists agree that there's warming and it's dangerous and we need to do something about it. When you go through his data, David Leggett, who's a known climatologist and statistician, tore it to shreds along with a team of statisticians and other scientists. And what you'll find is that the number of authors out of Cook's original 11,500 sample size, the number of authors who specifically stated that carbon dioxide from human activity is a danger was around about 40. It was about 0.3%. The 97% was a complete fabrication. I think it's a rest
just to clarify, I remember that study was about papers that are published in academic journals that support climate change was a thing. It wasn't about did humans cause it. It was their papers that
but
asked, did it happen? And they all agree it does happen.
No, the number of people that said that the Earth is being warmed by carbon dioxide and there's a danger was 41 out of 11,300. If you go back and have a look at the analysis, I can send you the analysis. If you give me an email address, I'll send it to you.
Sure. But again, the claim was that what percent of papers support global climate change is occurring, and it's 97% of all the papers show it is occurring. They don't state
claim,
is it dangerous. They don't say.
That's the claim. You said that when you do
only
the analysis,
40. So I agree with your claim. Your claim was that 40 papers say that climate change is occurring caused by human action or whatever. Most of the papers aren't about that. They don't care about human action. They're asking, is climate change occurring? And they all agree it is. Whether or not it's dangerous, what the causes are, if it's by humans, those are separate topics that many of the papers don't address. But the papers do agree global climate change is occurring. That was the agreement factor, not the human part, not the danger part. It was
no,
just the happening part.
If you look at what Cook et al. Did, that is not correct. They misrepresented it by saying that these scientists agree that there's a problem with carbon dioxide from human activity, and that is false. 97% of scientists do not agree with that.
Well, I know Potholer, who's done an extensive analysis on this, has pretty good confirming data that it is exactly what he says. When literally,
well, I'll show you what David Leggett, the statistician, did, and I'll show you that. So, where can I send your email on Friday?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, that email will get you the link to this podcast that you said. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I will send the email. I'll send Jeff. Jeff is like doing our correspondence. I'll send him all the links and things, and we can do correspondence through him because he has everything figured out. He has all of my emails organized, and I do not have them organized. So,
can I also send you? I've recently made a submission to a parliamentary inquiry. I'll send you that as well. It's got it's got 4 attachments, which are only 2 pages each, very succinct, and they provide a summary.
Sure, absolutely. I'd love for you to take a look at Potholer's videos, and maybe we can set up a conversation with him. That would be very entertaining.
Sure,
he's an actual scientist who works in the field. It's his YouTube channel is called Potholer 45, 52, some number, but he's an expert in the field.
Okay, and we've got a scientist who's been awarded an Order of Australia Medal for his studies, for his contributions to research in this country. He's gone in. He's a statistical whiz. He's a renaissance man. He's just phenomenal. He's a computer expert. He's very, very objective. No ego, no emotions driving him. And Peter is just such a wonderful man. He's gone in and collected 24,000 data sets from around the world, all legal. He's gone in and scraped these data sets off various databases. He's been in correspondence with authors of climate papers, both sides of the argument, and he's collected 24,000 data sets. He's mixed and matched them together and analyzed them. And Peter's done a phenomenal job. So I'm happy to bring him along to the discussion as well.
Perfect. It sounds great. But we have been going on for an hour, and that was our scheduled time. So I want to be respectful of your time. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
I'll send you that link on not the link, the submission to the inquiry, and perhaps one day we could talk about energy policy, because that is gutting our country right now.
Absolutely. I will look forward to setting up our future conversation. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, and the same to you, Tom. Thanks for the invitation.